Neil Gaiman is one of the most incredible writers of this current generation, but his works seem very awkward to adapt to the screen. There have been multiple attempts to create television shows out of his works, but most of them seem to fail. The latest failure was American Gods, as it was cancelled back in 2021, so what is the trouble with Neil Gaiman's works and adapting them to screen? Well, stay tuned to today's video as we're going to cover just that. First up, the failure of American Gods and the trouble with Neil Gaiman. Just last year, during March of 2021, it was announced the adaptation of American Gods was cancelled after 3 seasons and 4 different showrunners. The first season of the show was pretty well adapted, but each season past that just fell short of the original book by Neil Gaiman. The splashy TV adaptation was adapted from the award-winning novel American Gods by Neil Gaiman and should have been a huge success. However, the series had a lot of rocky moments, and it just shows how a lot of its work falters on the screen. This has left a lot of fans wondering if his style of fantasy fiction might be unadaptable to the screen. Over the last few years, there have been more adaptations of his work than have worked more than the previous ones, but even then, they aren't as true as they could be. Gaiman's long career flew into high gear during the early 90s after he created the Sandman. This series was obviously recently adapted for Netflix and is definitely his most successful one to date. The book draws inspiration from the dark mind of Alan Moore and the wit of Douglas Adams. He created a wholly original base story around unused DC comic book characters. The series incorporates gods, monsters, and legends from all different cultures and points in history. The Sandman is a New York Times best-selling smash hit and cemented his reputation as a modern mythmaker in the comic book scene. Throughout his time in the spotlight, he has made a bunch of different novels, short stories, and novellas that all deal with fantastically dark and rich developed worlds. They are all topped with a bunch of English humor that has allowed his books to gain widespread acclaim throughout the world. His books are shelved in both children's and adult sections in bookstores, as he can accustom that wide range of people. Some of his most popular books are Stardust, American Gods, Coraline, The Graveyard Book, and The Ocean at the End of the Lane. All of these and more are considered some of the best pieces of fantasy work in the modern era. He's even collaborated with people like Terry Pratchett on books like Good Omens, which is also adapted into an Amazon series. You can see that they have adapted many of his works on screen, and not a lot of them have worked. Coraline was adapted into a full feature-length animated film and is well regarded as one of his best adaptations yet. However, some of his other works aren't as good as Good Omens. The series did super well on Amazon Prime, but is nowhere near as popular as it could have been. What about some of his early works? Some of the earliest Gaiman adaptations, like 2007's Stardust, starring Claire Danes, and 2009's charmingly stop-motion animated Coraline from Leica Studios, were warmly received. They may have been the modest hits, but they've only grown in the audience's estimation over the time. Perhaps most importantly, they're well-liked by Gaiman fans. Stardust, the story of a young adventurous man and the grumpy fallen star who loves him, is such a loose adaptation of Gaiman's book that it borders on a reimagining. The intent of screenwriter Jane Goldman and director Matthew Vaughn was clearly to try to fashion a Princess Bride-esque classic for a new generation. They fell somewhat short, but the result is still quite fun. It's worth noting that while Gaiman describes visiting with Goldman and Vaughn as they worked on the script and giving his input on adaptive changes, he did not ultimately have a screenplay credit, so it was unclear whether he had the final say. Gaiman didn't get a screenplay credit when it came to Coraline, even though it's based on one of his shortest and most overtly kid-friendly books. The film's about a girl trapped in a creepy alternative reality of her life. After the success of Coraline and the mainstream success Greek-style TV in the early 2010s, he started writing episodes of Doctor Who. He started to get more involved in adapting his own stories for television and film after this. He tried to make the best of his time in his early career and try to make it towards Hollywood, which he successfully did. American Gods was one of his first major adaptations and started off pretty poorly. Whilst the first season was pretty well regarded, it did lose its first showrunner from the start, as Bryson Fuller had to leave the project. This was what Neil Gaiman said about that. Quote, "Thinking I was clever, coming in with Terry Pratchett, we both knew that we were very smart, and watching ourselves have a typical Hollywood experience with all the cliches, I remember recovering and licking my wounds somewhere around 1996, talking to Lisa Henson, with whom I had made friends at some point, and saying, how do people do this? How can you survive this experience?" The first season was definitely the best season of American Gods, and it's pretty telling because Neil Gaiman had very little to do with it. One of the weirdest things he ever said about American Gods was that one of the best episodes was centered around Laura and had little to do with the book at all. He said that the way they told the story was absolutely the showrunner's idea and was phenomenal. He said the reason why it was one of his favorite episodes is there was nothing he wrote within there, and it was like he was in the audience for something that felt completely in his world, and he loved it. This really shows his mindset on his works, as he definitely doesn't want much involvement, but does want the works to be a part of his own world. Some some behind-the-scenes reports did indicate that Neil Gaiman was displeased with some of his departures from the book. The showrunners said they were eager to make Gaiman happy as they wanted to keep American Gods in line with Neil Gaiman wanted. During season 2, Neil Gaiman was titled as co-showrunner, and it happened to be the most successful season of the show. Behind-the-scenes strife bubbled up over a messy storyline and changes in the cast. The failure of American Gods and Good Omens. During the time that Neil Gaiman was co-showrunning the second season of American Gods, he was also trying to run Amazon's adaptation of Good Omens. He had a lot of hands-on involvement with this adaptation of his book, but the series failed to capture the magic of his well-beloved novel. The series did work, however, but mainly because of the natural chemistry between David Tennant and Michael Sheen. The story was sadly pretty bad and fell flat on the screen. You can tell that Neil Gaiman has had many creative struggles over the years with adapting his works to screen. His works are very inventive and crazy, and they offer much stimulation for the imagination for those who read them. Gaiman is definitely amazing at putting his works into a piece of paper, but they don't necessarily always translate on screen. This is the same for many pieces of work, as sometimes the style and creativity just don't translate into the picture. Look at some Japanese works, for example. Many Japanese writers create manga. This is like a Japanese comic book type of thing, and sometimes these works just do not translate well to screen. One of the most well-renowned manga artists in Japan, named Junji Ito, has some phenomenal and outstanding work under his belt. He created some of the best horror art and stories there are in the industry, but he failed in creating any semblance of a good project on screen with his works. His art and storytelling are just so specific in the pages of a book that it doesn't just work through the animation. The only way to keep it faithful is by literal adaptation page by page onto the screen. They're attempting this sometime this year with the release of one of his stories. We don't know if it's gonna work or not, but it does show that with works like this, the only way to adapt it properly is direct adaptation. The problem with this is that it strays away from the heart of the world adaptation. The whole point of an adaptation is to change a few things and tweak them to make them fit a different medium. Just copying an entire story from a book to a screen doesn't give anything to the original audience members. This is an issue that Neil Gaiman has come across, as he doesn't want the changes to work too much, but finds that they just don't work on screen in Hollywood. His weird and fantastical worlds just don't work on screen, and he definitely needs to learn that lesson. And that's the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed the latest video. If you did, would you please let us know in the comments below? Make sure to like the video, comment below, and of course subscribe to the channel with the notification bell rung. Thank you for watching today's video. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.